Continue our discussion, our focus on private sector corruption or corporate corruption. Here to help us discuss how the country, for example, is dealing with this scourge is Dr. Ivor Sarakinsky from the Wits School of Governance. Morning, sir, and thank you very much for your time. Corruption governance. You are at the Wits School of Governance. Are our government's processes in South Africa failing us? And hence, it is so easy to get gaps, and directors of companies and everybody else finds these gaps to use and escape. Or are we not actually implementing good, sound governance in South Africa?
In terms of the private sector, the regulatory framework is perhaps better and better enforced than in the public sector. But it doesn't mean that the bar is very high. It's just better. The problem in the private sector is that you're dealing with technocrats, accountants, lawyers, the best of the best, who know how to loophole the system, who have the resources to buy influence, to cover their tracks, and to pull these kinds of acts off. So fraud, embezzlement, not compliance with the Company Act is far more prevalent than we see in the media, and it's your typical white-collar crime scenario, the hidden crime that has quite a dramatic impact on society.
And now and again, you'll see exposure or something exploding from the private sector, like the Steinhoff case recently.
Yes, so those things hit the newspapers because the market eventually speaks in terms of shares and investors and oversight bodies watching their money, and they interpret the results and they start to see things not going in the right direction. The inquiry starts and then the scandal hits the newspaper.
Now, recently, Chief Justice Mogoeng, he was talking when he was being installed as a Chancellor of the University of KwaZulu-Natal, just to remind ourselves. He said, and I quote, "There's corruption and wrongdoing in the private sector. How it escapes the public space or finds some space for a little while, then disappears, has confounded me for a very long time." Are we in the media, for instance, that's one of the public spaces, not focusing enough and trying to dig deep enough on really how corruption is also rooted in many organizations in our country?
It's much harder to do in the private sector because you've got accounting, massaging the numbers, chartered accountants who specialize in this, lawyers who specialize in it. So it's much harder to track it, to identify who's responsible, and to place these cases on a court roll. The evidence, the leading of the evidence requires such intensive expertise that it's very hard to prosecute. It's much easier to do these kinds of things in the public sector.
Yeah. Now, just another man who was very much in the public sector, former Deputy Minister of Finance, Mr. Jonas. Remember the story about him having been offered 600 million rand bribe by the Guptas, who run a private company. So that's private sector corruption. He said last Friday actually, in Port Elizabeth, the PricewaterhouseCoopers has got a global survey. It's called the Economic Crime Survey. South Africa is not doing very well there. And Mr. Jonas was saying that he believes South Africa now has a chance to start changing things back, to root out corruption. Do you think we are standing at that point in your analysis that from a governance perspective, maybe we have an opportunity now with President also Ramaphosa saying in Parliament last month there has to be a focus of rooting out corruption in both the private and the public sector? Well,
there's the political will now. Is there the institutional expertise and capacity to prosecute those cases? That's the question. So if you look at the shedding of expertise in the NPA and the investigatory services over the last 10 years, do those people exist? And do the auditing houses have a reputation where you can rely on the evidence that they present? There are big scandals around many of those big auditing firms. So one of the problems is who audits the auditors in terms of getting the information that you need to prosecute these cases.
Yeah. Now, could there be a, you know, like we've got NEDLAC, I'm using that as an example, where government, labor and business sit together. Should we be looking at bringing together the private sector, the government, the civil society, to try and develop or define solutions, practical solutions of how to address, one, the capacity issue, the knowledge gap that exists in making sure that we can really ask the right questions?
Well, there already is a National Anti-Corruption Forum which brings all those stakeholders together. I can't remember when it last met, and I'm not sure what was on the agenda either. So there is a major gap in terms of coordinating all the relevant sectors. But it goes beyond organized business and organized government, because a lot of the corruption occurs in businesses that aren't part of these associations, smaller businesses. Cutting deals at local level is way beyond the ambit of these organizations to coordinate.
So it's not only big business, you've got small private sector, the small companies and stuff who are also caught up in this web of corruption.
Yes, it's a relationship, corruptor and corruptee, and both parties, either in the private sector or within the public sector, build a relationship. And it's that relationship which is very hard to penetrate, expose, and prosecute.
Yeah, very briefly, Dr. Sarakinsky, governance. Yes. I mean, should we be teaching governance from school? I'm just thinking now, just off the cuff, should we make sure that among the subjects, besides ethics and stuff, should we be teaching governance, basic rules of governance from high school?
Well, I have a conflict of interest in answering that question, seeing I'm from the School of Governance. But I think that there would be some merit in getting basic principles of what governance means in terms of rules, regulations, compliance, amending regulations, an ordered way of regulating society to take society forward.
Thank you very much. What I was trying to get to was that by the time somebody becomes an entrepreneur after matric or something, they should be aware of the rules of the game in terms of governance, in terms of behavior. Thank you very much. I didn't want to put you on the spot there in terms of your school. That's Dr. Ivor Sarakinsky from the Wits School of Governance.